David Jones, thank you very much for accepting my request, and I'm very grateful to you. You need no introduction. You've been Member of Parliament since 2005. You've been the West Secretary between 2012 and 2014, and then during the Theresa May Premiership, you've been the Brexit Minister for 1 year. And so my first question is, how was for you to get re-elected to Parliament?
Well, I was very pleased. It was a difficult election. It was more difficult than we anticipated it would be. Colleagues of mine around the country were unfortunately losing their seats. I managed to increase my vote and increase my share of the vote, but because the Labour candidate increased his share, my majority went down. But nevertheless, I had a healthy majority, and it was a good result.
And Wales, it was one of the two countries which voted for Brexit last year,
Yes.
and so your party, as the Brexit party, more than Labour, they were quite confident that they were going to make some major gains, but it didn't happen, and some of your colleagues, including Byron Davies and so many others, they lost their seat. So
yes, that was a great shame. I think that there were a number of reasons for this. I think that we had a disappointing manifesto. And I think also we made the mistake of thinking that because we had supported Brexit, UKIP supporters, when they decided which party to vote for, UKIP having lost a lot of popularity, would automatically vote Conservative. And I think that the way it worked was that UKIP supporters took the view that we'd triggered Article 50 by that stage, which leads the way to our departure from the European Union, and they therefore regarded the job as done. So I think a lot of them who'd previously been Labour supporters decided to revert to Labour. Plus, of course, we had a big increase in the number of first-time voters, and I think that actually worked against us too. So unfortunately, we didn't do as well as we wanted to. We went down to 8 seats in Wales, which is where we were in 2010.
when you first saw the exit poll, did you believe it?
Yes, I did, because it had always been extremely accurate. It was very accurate back in 2015, when of course it was better news for us. So I think that everybody, at least in the room I was in, were quite disappointed.
And Jeremy Corbyn, he was the unknown character in British politics. How surprised are you to see that people chanting his name, "Oh, Jeremy Corbyn," and then his popularity rise across the country? Are you worried about the prospect of Jeremy Corbyn in Downing Street as Prime Minister?
Well, I still think that's extremely unlikely. I think that Jeremy Corbyn does have a constituency of his own, which is a very, frankly, hard left constituency, and he is gathering support from that quarter. We must remember, again, going back to the 2017 election, the one that we just had, that what we saw was more people voting Conservative, but not quite as many more as were voting Labour. And what we've now got is two-party politics, but with Conservatives in the lead. I don't actually think that the sort of politics that Jeremy Corbyn follows is the sort of politics that people in this country really want. I think that he's pretty much an unknown quantity, which is surprising because he's been in this house for well over 30 years. And I think that when people start analysing what he says, the sort of thing that he wants, for example, the really irresponsible spending that he is proposing with a £100 billion black hole, for example, in his education budget, I think they'll start wondering whether he is indeed the person to support. But for the time being, people don't really know much about it.
Mm-hmm. And that policy is quite very popular with the youngsters. And as I was interviewing Norman Tebbit, and I asked him about the Corbyn phenomenon, he said to me that because those youngsters who voted for him, they're uneducated, and when Lord Tebbit, he was young himself, he managed to educate himself on various policies. So do you think that all those people who voted Corbyn, they're uneducated?
I wouldn't say they're uneducated, no. In fact, I would say some of them are well educated. For example, those who thought that his policy of wiping the slate clean in respect of university fees were obviously well educated, but probably just voting for him because they thought that they would save themselves a large sum of money. But I think actually a lot of the people who were supporting him were very young indeed. They didn't, for example, remember the last Labour administration, and certainly wouldn't remember the disastrous Labour administrations of the past, where this country has ended up almost bankrupt as a consequence of Labour policies. So I think that that's a problem too. Time marches on, and very young people don't know much about how bad life can be under a Labour government.
It's quite interesting because before the election we're talking about who will replace Jeremy Corbyn after the election, and now he's been strengthening his position thanks to the good results for his party. But now we're talking about who will be replacing Theresa May in the foreseeable future.
There is some talk about that, but I think that most Conservative MPs take the view that she's there. We need to make sure that we have as much continuity as possible with the Brexit negotiations coming up. And I think in the Labour Party too, Jeremy Corbyn's position is not as secure as he might think.
More than before?
Well, possibly. Certainly he has support in the wider Labour Party. In the Parliamentary Labour Party, of course, there are still those who are very concerned about him. And we see good members of Parliament who apparently are facing deselection, which is rather worrying. Some extremely moderate, good Labour MPs who are now finding that they've incurred the wrath of momentum.
And Labour Party, they gained 40 more parliamentary MPs, and then Theresa May, right before the election, she said that if your party only loses 6 seats in Parliament, and then we'll be seeing Jeremy Corbyn in Downing Street. Why didn't that happen then?
Well, I don't think it happened because although he had more MPs, he didn't win the election. I mean, we won the election, but we didn't win it with an overall majority. And, you know, as the largest party, constitutionally, we have the right to seek to form the government, which is what we're doing. But of course, it is much more difficult now that we've got fewer members of Parliament and no overall majority.
And before the general election, we had local elections, and your party, they scored very good outcome at those elections. Why it didn't translate in general election?
I think there were a number of reasons. I think one of the reasons was that we portrayed this as being a Brexit election, the election basically being on the basis of which party do you think can get the best deal for Britain out of the Brexit negotiations. In fact, I think that the electorate, by and large, had almost discounted Brexit as an issue. They accepted that the country had voted in the referendum to leave, and they also accepted that we triggered the Article 50 process, which is the process to lead us out of the EU. So I think that although it was thought at the time that Brexit would be the overwhelming issue of the election, in fact it was far more bread and butter issues that actually counted so far as the electorate were concerned. So what we saw then, of course, was the manifesto, and the manifesto was disappointing.
Did you object it at the time of the election?
Well, I essentially we didn't have any time to object because, of course, the manifesto was produced quite quickly, and of course none of the candidates had sight of the manifesto before it was actually published.
But you were still Brexit minister. Is it because you were banned by the cabinet responsibility that you shouldn't have objected the?
No, not at all. I mean, I was not involved in the manifesto process in any way. That was a small number of people, which didn't include me among them. And then there were elements of the manifesto that didn't go down too well, most notably, of course, the social care policy, which a lot of people were concerned about. But there were little issues, for example, the issue of whether or not everybody should automatically have the winter fuel allowance, which, although it didn't seem on the face of it to be very significant, actually did on the doorstep proved to be quite an important issue. And a lot of people were saying, well, I'm actually entitled to this. It's my entitlement. Why are you taking this money away from us? And things like that actually, I think, played quite badly. And it was a difficult election campaign, as you know. I mean, we had some terrorist incidents which were very distressing, and it was generally a very difficult election campaign on many levels.
Joe Kaufman famously called Michael Foot's manifesto in 1983 the longest suicidal note in history. Would you recall the same for this manifesto?
No, it wasn't as bad as Michael Foot's manifesto. I remember that one, and it wasn't as bad as that. But there were errors in it, which I think everybody acknowledged. And I think it illustrates that really a manifesto does take time to produce, and you know the parties need to consider the policies that are being announced very carefully. And of course, because this was a snap election, the manifesto was produced rather hurriedly, and the consequence was that there were aspects of it that were not really satisfactory so far as the electorate were concerned.
Before the EU referendum, your side of the argument was that Brexit will mark the end of austerity and people will see real rises in their wages, and then people at the time of the general election, they felt that this was not going to happen. So why?
No, I don't think that's right. I think that they actually reacted to policies that were announced by Jeremy Corbyn, which were uncosted and which in fact were unsustainable. I've just explained that I think that, for example, students maybe were attracted to a policy that said that their slate would be wiped clean in respect of their university tuition fees. So far as the Brexit bonus is concerned, of course, well, we haven't actually left the European Union yet, and we won't be leaving until 2019. But of course, at that time, we will be in a position to save quite a lot of money, and I think that will probably be something that people will realise more strongly when we get to that point.
And the big surprise of this election was that you thought that a lot of UK voters would defect back to your party, whereas they defected back to Labour because they committed as well to take us out of the single market.
Yes, but so far as Labour were concerned, it depended very much on the audience they were speaking to. I mean, that's the luxury that the principal opposition party has. But you're right, over 80% of the electorate voted for parties who had committed to leaving the European Union. And Labour have got to remember that in the debates that we're going to be having over the withdrawal bill, which has been announced today.
And you were the Brexit minister for 1 year. Were you allowed to attend cabinet meetings?
No, the cabinet meetings were attended by the Secretary of State, and there's also.
But Brendan Lewis now he's allowed as Home Office Minister to attend.
Well, there are some exceptions that are made, and there are some non-cabinet ministers who, by convention, do attend cabinet. The DEXU Minister of State is not one of those. But bear in mind also that there is a cabinet subcommittee that deals exclusively with Brexit. That's a much smaller number of people than the people in the cabinet, and that of course includes the Secretary of State for DEXU as well.
So those cabinet meetings with Theresa May, because you were the worst secretary,
yes.
And in what ways her premiership was different? The way that she would argue policies were different than David Cameron.
Well, remember, I wasn't in cabinet, so I've
Yes.
not actually seen the way that Theresa May presented and discussed policy. So I can't really comment on that, because although I remember David Cameron very well, because I was in cabinet then, I was not at the time of Theresa May's premiership.
And now on the article that you wrote on Mail on Sunday, you said that you just urged that wing of your party in the cabinet that they want to frustrate the will of the British people. Why did you decide to write that article?
Well, because I think that we have to be very careful. I think that there is perhaps a certain amount of complacency that because we've triggered the Article 50 process, it's going to be plain sailing and we'll be leaving the European Union. There are a number of those who never wanted us to leave and now are seeking a form of Brexit which is probably less than full departure from the European Union. And there are a large number of ways that they could seek to if you so to speak, soften Brexit. And that would be something that was not Brexit at all. And I just wanted to tell people that they should be alert to the fact that Remainers have not given up, that they still want to have something less than Brexit, and that they will carry on fighting for that. And we must make sure that we carry on doing whatever we can to ensure that we do leave the European Union and have our full sovereignty back as a country.
And that wing of the party, they led by Philip Hammond, the Chancellor in the Cabinet. Do you think that Philip Hammond now, who wants to frustrate the will of the British people?
No, I don't. And in fact, what I've noted is that very recently Philip Hammond has acknowledged that we will be leaving the single market, for example. So I don't think that Philip Hammond would intend to frustrate what we voted for. There may be issues, for example, such as how long an implementation period do we have after we've left.
What about the
European
transitional period?
Well, implementation period, transitional
yes.
period. You know, it's basically the same thing. I mean, there's some little nuances that may be different, but I think that Philip Hammond may want a slightly longer period than others, but these are things that we can negotiate, and I think that everybody, die-hard Brexiteers included, recognise that we're going to have a period between the end of our formal relationship with the EU and our ultimate departure, which is probably not going to be very long, maybe a year or two at the most.
As Labour had put in their manifesto that they would end free movement of people, therefore it means coming out of the single market, yes. And there is a cross-party consensus on that between Labour and the Conservatives, whereas on the two other issues, which you mentioned in your article, the ECJ membership, but also a customs union, because Philip Hammond is utterly against the idea to come out of customs union.
Well, again, I think that his position has altered somewhat fairly recently too. But the fact is that we can't strike our own free trade agreements around the world if we remain part of the customs union. That's completely impossible. Bear in mind that we've got a Department of State that is responsible solely for striking those free trade agreements, the Department of International Trade, headed by Liam Fox. So really, remaining in the customs union can't be possible if we do want to have these free trade agreements. So I think we will be leaving that. The European Court of Justice oversees the European Union's legal structures, but we've now given notice under Article 50 to leave. Article 50 says on the face of it that at the end of the 2-year period specified in the article, the departing member state will cease to be subject to the treaties. And one of the elements of the treaties, of course, is the supremacy of the European Court of Justice. So it's impossible to remain subject to the ECJ, and frankly, why would anyone want to remain subject to the jurisdiction of a foreign court when we have our own courts that are quite capable of adjudicating in the cases of any disputes in this country?
The new designate elect leader of the Lib Dems, Vince Cable, he has said that he would, as his capacity as the leader of the Liberals, he will try to stop Brexit from happening and to have a second referendum. And as a result, he's already talked to MPs across the floor. And so don't you think that after the election, because Theresa May, the whole point of the election was to strengthen her hand where she weakened it, that don't you think that Brexit, the clean Brexit or the hard Brexit, it's now dead in water?
It certainly isn't, because we have actually given the notice under Article 50. That has set the clock running. Under the Article 50 procedure, at the end of 2 years, we leave the European Union. The only exception would be is if all 27 continuing member states and the United Kingdom agreed that that should not happen. And I think it's inconceivable that the United Kingdom would want to agree to that, or any leader of any party could politically agree to that, given the outcome of the referendum. And furthermore, of course, there's no guarantee that the continuing European Union member states would want that to happen. So I think that Vince Cable, with due respect, because I like Vince and he's a nice chap, but I think that he's completely off beam here. I don't think he fully understands that the triggering of Article 50 was the moment that we crossed the Rubicon.
What about the divorce bill? Because Michel Barnier has said that we have to pay the full amount, and then Boris Johnson, the Foreign Secretary, said that they can go whistle. Do you think that we could use that kind of language?
Well, Boris is Boris, and Boris uses the sort of language that he does, and everybody knows him and loves him for it. But
At the time that we're facing...
I think that the important thing to remember about the so-called bill is this. There have been various figures that have been bandied about. We've seen as much as 100 billion euros at one extreme, and on the other extreme we've seen evidence from a House of Lords committee that we actually owe nothing at all. We have made it clear that we will always honour our international obligations. The important thing is that we agree the methodology by which we work out whatever sums may be owing in either direction, and proceed on the basis of that agreed methodology to work out a figure which could move in either direction too. But at the moment there's a lot of shadow boxing going on. There's an awful lot of posturing for the cameras and the news media. And I think that the important thing to remember is that the serious negotiation is happening behind closed doors in Brussels in a conference room. And that is where the agreed figure will emerge. And of course, if we can't agree at the end of 2 years, we leave. So the clock is ticking, but it's as much a challenge to the European Union as it is to the UK. Everybody wants to get an agreement if they can, but if they can't get an agreement, the treaty says at the end of 2 years we simply leave.
And do you think that businesses are quite confident for us leaving?
I think that businesses initially, after the referendum, were shocked. I think that there was a general feeling of shock at the outcome of the referendum. I spent a lot of my time as a Brexit minister speaking to businesses, speaking to representatives of business. And you could actually see after a while people getting used to the idea that we were leaving, and recognising that although there would inevitably be a degree of disruption, because you can't have such a major step as Brexit without something having to change, although there would be a bit of disruption, at the same time there are huge opportunities for this country around the world. We can strike new free trade agreements. Already Australia, only a few days ago, said that they're really keen to strike an agreement. President Trump has said he wants an agreement, a free trade agreement. There's the potential for FTAs with India, with China, and so on. And there are big opportunities, and I think that businesses are alert to that. And in particular, the City of London, which is the foremost financial centre in the world, is also starting to recognise that there are new opportunities that are presenting themselves.
Two last questions. The first one is, last time when I interviewed Norman Tebbit, who's been a staunch Brexiteer for quite some time, for decades at least, and when I asked him how he foresees the future of the United Kingdom within the next 5 years, it seemed to me he was more optimistic about Scotland because they wouldn't go independent for quite some time than he was about Brexit.
Well, I think that one of the things that emerged from the general election was a clear signal that the Scottish people don't want independence. We saw the SNP representation radically cut. We saw 13 Conservative members of Parliament being elected from Scotland, and I think that there's a very clear message coming from the Scottish people that they're really fed up with talk about independence, and what they want to see is the Scottish government actually delivering for Scotland. So I think that Norman Tebbit is right. I think that the future in Scotland looks very positive. I think for the rest of the country, there will be various parts of the country that will have varying effects, but I think that overall we will be a more prosperous country once we've left the European Union. I think that we will see new investments coming into this country. I think that...
At the moment?
Well, I think, well, yes, but if you look at, for example, at James Dyson, who announced fairly recently that he was building a new innovation campus in Wiltshire.
Well, he supported Brexit himself.
Well, he did indeed, and what he's doing is actually voting with his money. He's putting his own money where his mouth is. And he's now made it clear that he regards this country as a future global innovation hub. For example, you saw SoftBank buying into ARM, the microchip designers, making new investments, big investments from other companies too. So I think that this country, because it's a very innovative country, has got a good future ahead of it. And I think that it's a future that will be global, and we will be far less constrained than we are at the moment. We can seek new markets, and we can adjust our own affairs to attract business into this country.
And the last question, another issue which is haunting your party is the 1% cap in the public sector. So do you think that we have to review, the Chancellor needs to review that?
Well, this is a matter for the Chancellor, but what I would say is that we are reducing the deficit radically. Back in 2008, this country, and many other countries too, very nearly went bankrupt as a consequence of the global financial crisis. We've clawed our way back, we've reduced the deficit considerably, and I think that we do have to be very careful about succumbing to the temptation of loosening the purse strings and then backsliding to a position which is less advantageous. As it is, it's going to take a long time before we completely clear the deficit and start paying off the debt that we incurred in those years. And it's not fair on future generations that we should saddle them with that sort of debt. So I think that the Chancellor, and I'm sure he will be, has to think very carefully about the impact any loosening of the current restraint would have upon the economy generally.
And lastly, at the end of each interview, I ask my distinguished guests who've been involved in politics for quite some time, how would they like to be remembered for? Because Tony Benn famously said, I was once national threat and now I'm a national treasure. So how would you like to remember?
How would I like to be remembered? I would like to be remembered as someone who was concerned about the independence of his country and did his very best to ensure that it became once again an independent country.
On that note, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.